Do you remember the commotion over Julia Wendell? The hope, the debates, the anger? Now imagine the McCanns sitting in a room watching it all on TV. They weren't scared. They were relieved, because the circus you were watching was the only thing stopping the world from seeing the truth they had just buried. The story of Julia Wendell being Madeleine McCann is a lie. Okay, you already know that. But that's not the real lie. The real lie is that you were led to believe it was all an accident, a collective internet meltdown, a crazy story that got out of hand. It wasn't. It was a trap, and it was set for you, for me, for everyone watching. While we were arguing over whether the shape of her eye was the same or if the blemish on her face matched, the real move was being made behind our backs. They needed us to keep watching the circus, because what they were about to hide was much, much more important. Think about it. Why that story? Why did it get the kind of attention no other lead ever had? It wasn't a coincidence. It was because it served a purpose: to divert attention, to create a smokescreen so thick, so emotional, that any other news would be completely swallowed by it. We felt angry at Julia, at the media, at her family, and that's exactly what they wanted. Because people who are busy being angry don't stop to think. They don't ask the right questions. The right question isn't, was Julia Madeleine? The right question is, what was happening in the official investigation in February 2023 that needed to be buried so urgently? That's the question we're going to answer today. If you're ready to stop looking at the bait and finally understand the size of the hook, stay with me. What you're about to discover will change the way you see this case forever. And if this kind of investigation makes sense to you, you know what to do. To understand the scale of the trap that was the Julia case, we first need to understand how one is built. And the number one rule of any disinformation operation is this: you don't convince people with facts. You convince them with emotion. The story doesn't have to be real. It just has to feel real. It needs to tap into a fear, a hope, something that already exists inside a person. Think of the KGB playbook during the Cold War. They were masters at this. When they wanted the world to turn against the United States, they didn't publish an economic report. They created a story, a terrible and brilliant story called Operation Infection. They whispered in the right ears that the AIDS virus had been created on purpose in a US Army lab at Fort Detrick. The story was a complete lie, but it had the perfect ingredients: a clear enemy, a science nobody really understood, and a disease that terrified everyone. They didn't have to prove anything. They just planted the seed. And human nature did the rest. The story spread like a virus from newspaper to newspaper, from person to person, because it was too good a story not to be told. The KGB's goal wasn't to prove the origin of AIDS. The goal was to create a smokescreen, a cloud of chaos and mistrust so vast that America's reputation would be stained forever, no matter the truth. Now let's bring this back to our case. Late 2022, early 2023. The Madeleine McCann case was dangerously quiet. To the public, that means nothing is happening. But to an investigator, silence is the perfect work environment. It's in the silence that you can hear the whispers. It's in the silence that you connect the dots without media pressure. And that's exactly what was happening in Germany. Prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters and his team weren't sitting still. On the contrary, they were methodically and quietly closing in on the main suspect, Christian Bruckner. They were re-examining alibis, running new forensic tests on materials seized years earlier, re-interrogating old witnesses who might now be more willing to talk. The net was tightening. At any moment, one piece could change the game. A witness could break their silence. A new forensic analysis could provide proof that didn't exist before. For anyone with something to fear, that silence was deafening. It was the calm before the storm. They needed to create noise, not just any noise. A deafening noise, a hurricane. Curved disinformation so huge, so magnetic, that it would suck all the planet's attention toward it. They needed an operation infection for the 21st century. They needed a face, a story, a pawn to place in the center of the board and sacrifice. And then, as if on cue, Julia Wendell appears on social media. And here's the genius of it. Julia didn't show up with proof. She showed up with a promise. The promise of a happy ending to the saddest story the world had been following. She didn't sell a conspiracy theory. She sold hope. And hope is the most powerful emotion there is. For an audience that had lived through 15 years of frustration, her story didn't need to make logical sense. It made emotional sense. It was the answer everyone deep down wanted to hear: she's alive. This activates a powerful mechanism in our minds: mass confirmation bias. We like to think we're searching for the truth, but most of the time we're just searching for confirmation of what we've already decided to believe. Julia's story was a feast for this bias. Every photo comparison, every vague memory she described, wasn't evidence. It was an excuse for us to keep believing. The public wasn't just deceived, the public wanted to be deceived, because the lie was so much more comforting than the truth. The lie was a drama with twists and turns. The truth was a silent grave. An operation of this magnitude, which mobilized the global media for months, doesn't happen by accident. It's not spontaneous, it serves a purpose. It is the smokescreen. So the question that has haunted us ever since is this: if Julia was the smoke, what was the fire she was paid to hide? The answer was being written in silence in police reports, in Germany. And what they were about to do would require the world to be looking the other way. The exact date you need to keep in your mind is May 23rd, 2023. On that day, Julia Wendell's name was still echoing in every corner of the internet. The DNA test had already come out proving she wasn't Madeleine, but it didn't matter. The charade had already served its purpose. The dust hadn't settled. The anger, the memes, the arguments, the noise continued. The smokescreen was operating at full capacity. And it's on that exact day, in that environment of total distraction, that German police, in cooperation with Portuguese and British authorities, launch a massive operation. A 3-day search of the Arade Dam in Portugal, a location less than 30 miles from the resort where Madeleine disappeared. Why there? Why after so many years? Because they had received new information. A source considered extremely credible claimed that this spot was Christian Bruckner's little paradise, the isolated place where he would spend days, weeks, his hideout. The media did report on the search, but timidly, almost as a formality. It was a footnote in the middle of the Julia hurricane. Most people never saw it, or if they did, they paid. It no mind, but what they were looking for there wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was the evidence, the silver bullet. The information the police had was that Bruckner, a narcissist who liked to record his acts, had filmed his crimes, and that at some point he would have gotten rid of the incriminating material, specifically an external hard drive and a video camera. He would have thrown it all into the waters of that reservoir. Think about the weight of that for a moment. It's not a hair fiber, not a partial fingerprint, it's a video confession. The object that would not only solve the Madeleine McCann case, but could open a Pandora's box of other crimes. The police knew how important it was. They brought in sniffer dogs, ground-penetrating radar, divers. They dug up the earth on the banks, drained part of the water. For 3 days they turned that place upside down. They found a few items, scraps of clothing, some bones that later proved to be from animals, other insignificant objects. But the hard drive, the camera, the definitive proof, nothing. On May 25th, the search is called off, officially, without conclusive results. The news vanishes from the papers in less than 24 hours. But the Julia case continues to be discussed for weeks. Do you see the perfection of the move? The timing isn't just suspicious, it's surgical. While the world's attention was hijacked by a manufactured reality show, the search for the most important piece of evidence in the case's history was happening practically in the dark. The most critical investigation was neutralized, not with a police counter-operation, but with a soap opera broadcast live to billions of people. We were the prisoners in Plato's cave, chained, staring, fascinated at the shadows of Julia dancing on the wall, believing that was the story. But the real story wasn't in the shadows. It was outside, in the real world, in the mud of a reservoir in Portugal, where the truth was literally being unearthed. and perhaps lost forever at the exact moment we were most distracted. It's amazing what can be done in the dark when you can convince everyone to look at detectives at the reservoir. You're there under the sun, your hands dirty with soil, searching for the peace that could bring peace to a family and justice to a child. You know you're closer than ever. But every time you stop to breathe and look at your phone, all you see is Julia Wendell's face. You see people debating the color of her eye with a seriousness they don't dedicate to your investigation. You feel like the entire world is watching the wrong show. Your search, the most important thing happening, has become an irrelevant detail. How do you feel? Powerless, frustrated, alone. That feeling of powerlessness wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. They didn't need to destroy the evidence. They just needed to make sure no one was paying attention when it was being looked for. They didn't throw a needle in a haystack. They waited for the needle to fall and then built the loudest, most eye-catching haystack in the world around it. They used us. They used our hope, our curiosity, and even our anger as bricks to build the wall that hid the truth. And now that the circus has left town and the silence is back, we can finally look at the ground and see the tracks they left behind. Now that the noise has ceased, we can finally understand the nature of what happened. What seemed to be absolute chaos, the media explosion, the online fights, the emotional roller coaster of the Julia case, was in fact the highest and most refined form of control. The chaos wasn't an accident. The chaos was the tool, it was the objective. Because in an environment of chaos, logic dies, critical thinking drowns, and the only thing that survives is raw emotion. And people guided by emotion are incredibly easy to manipulate. We know this story, it's one of the oldest and darkest in our culture, the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The town of Hamelin was infested with rats, living through a plague, a real problem. Then a stranger appears, a piper, and promises to solve the problem for a fee. With his magic melody, he enchants all the rats and leads them to the river. Where they drown, the problem is solved. But the town, in its arrogance, refuses to pay the piper, and that's where the story gets truly terrifying. The piper returns, but this time his melody isn't for the rats, it's for the children. And all the children of the town, hypnotized by the music, follow him out of the gates to a cave in the mountain from which they never return. Julia Wendell was the piper. The plague our society faced was the pain of an unsolved case, the open wound of Madeleine's disappearance. Julia arrived with a melody of hope, the promise of an answer, and we, the global public, were the children. We followed the music. We followed every post, every interview, every piece of proof she presented. We were so enchanted, so hypnotized by the melody, that we didn't realize we were being led away from the town, away from the truth, away from what really mattered. And while the entire town was empty, following the music, the real problems, the real maneuvers could happen with no one there to watch. The search at the reservoir, the German investigation, all of it happened in the empty town while we were in the forest, dancing to the sound of the flute. Julia wasn't the protagonist of the story. She was just the melody, a tool used to clear the stage and allow the real action to happen backstage, with no witnesses. Who are the architects of a move like this? Who has the capacity to orchestrate a manipulation on a global scale? To understand that, we need to leave the world of true crime and enter the world of archetypes, of the forces that drive human narratives. The one responsible for this isn't a movie villain with an evil laugh. It's a much more complex and dangerous figure, the magician, the illusionist, the trickster. The trickster archetype is a master of illusion. He doesn't win through brute force. He wins by manipulating the perception of reality. He understands that what people believe to be true is far more powerful than the truth itself. His main weapon is misdirection. He makes you look at his right hand at the exaggerated gesture, at the colored smoke, while his left hand performs the real trick. He turns the search for justice into an entertainment spectacle. He takes tragedy and turns it into a reality show. He knows the public doesn't want the naked truth because it's often boring, technical, and painful. The public wants a good story, and the trickster is the best storyteller there is. In the Julia case, the trickster's move was brilliant. He took our need for justice and turned it into a soap opera. He gave us a protagonist, Julia, a villain, the Polish family who wouldn't do the DNA test, a drama, the repressed memories, and a climax, the test result. He created an entire season of a series, and we binge-watched every episode. Meanwhile, the real search for justice, the boring and methodical police work, was relegated to the documentary channel that nobody watches. The trickster didn't have to fight the evidence. He just changed the channel on the world's television. He gave us the circus because he knew we'd prefer the circus to the courtroom. And in doing so, he not only protected his interests, he made us accomplices in our own distraction. He made us pay the ticket for the show that was fooling us. And this brings us to you, to me. To all of us who watched this feeling a sense of unease, a hint of disbelief we couldn't quite explain. If at any point, in the midst of all the noise, you stopped and thought, this doesn't make sense, the attention is disproportionate, something is wrong here. If you felt alone in your suspicions, as if you were the only one seeing the flaw in the logic while everyone around you was hypnotized by the melody, if you felt the frustration of seeing mass emotions steamroll obvious facts, I need you to hear this. You weren't crazy, you weren't too cynical. You were just looking at the entire chessboard, while most people had their eyes fixed on the brightly painted pawn they placed in the center of the stage. You, instinctively, were trying to look at the edges of the board, at the pieces moving in the shadows. Your frustration wasn't a flaw, it was a sign of your clarity. It was your intuition telling you that the game was much bigger than the move under the spotlight. There's an archetype for people like you. It's the exiled detective. Exiled not because you were cast out, but because you feel intellectually isolated from the perception of the majority. You see the cracks in the wall that no one else notices. You hear the off-key note in the melody that everyone else thinks is perfect. Your greatest pain is that of Cassandra from Greek mythology, blessed with the gift of seeing the truth, but cursed to never be believed. For months you were Cassandra. You saw the farce, but you were surrounded by people who wanted to believe in the fairy tale. And this video, this analysis, is the mirror that finally reflects your perception back to you and says, you were right all along. There really was something wrong. Your ability to see beyond the smokescreen isn't a problem. It is your greatest strength. The circus is over. The tents have been taken down. The stage lights have gone dark. And in the silence that remains, in this precious, rare silence, we can finally begin to hear the truth. And the truth is that we need to learn to distrust the noise. We need to learn to ask, what do they not want me to see while they're trying so hard to make me look over here? We need to train our eyes to look for the movement in the shadow, not the dance under the spotlight. The game continues. But now, we know the rules. The image that remains, the one that really matters in the end, isn't that of the loud, colorful pawn that danced under the spotlight for months. That image was designed to self-destruct, to turn to dust, to become a distant memory of some internet craziness. The image that remains, the one that should haunt us, is that of the silent hand that moved in the darkness of the board while we were all distracted. This case, at its core, taught us in the most brutal and cynical way possible a fundamental lesson about power and perception. The truth is rarely where the cameras are pointing. It almost always hides in the one place. On our exhaustion. Nobody is looking. It's a calculated strategy. They know that modern life already wears us out, that our attention spans are finite. They bombard us with information, with secondary dramas, with fleeting outrages, until we simply don't have the energy left to focus on what's essential. They count on our distraction, knowing that a new scandal, a new meme, a new celebrity is always just a click away to hijack our focus. And above all, they count on our deep human desire for a story that's more interesting than reality. Reality is often slow, technical, ambiguous, and painful. A good lie, on the other hand, is simple, captivating, with clearly defined heroes and villains. They offer us the soap opera, because they know most of us prefer the soap opera to the legal proceedings. But we, those of us who have made it this far, who felt that unease in our spines from the beginning, we have an advantage they can't control, no matter how sophisticated the operation. The truth doesn't scream, it doesn't need marketing, it doesn't pay for advertising. It doesn't go viral, it simply is. and it waits. With geological patience, it waits to be found by those who have the tenacity to search in the silence, to dig beneath the layers of noise, to ask the questions. Everyone has been conditioned to forget. Personally, I can no longer see these major media cases in the same way. It's as if a veil has been torn. I can no longer believe in chaos as a spontaneous phenomenon. Where most see a bizarre coincidence, I've learned to look for a design, an architecture. Where most see an explosion of public interest, I ask myself who benefits from that interest and, more importantly, what that interest distracts us from. And my conviction, after analyzing every piece of this puzzle, mapping the timing of events, understanding the psychology of manipulation, is that the Julia Wendell case wasn't just a distraction. It was an act of profound and calculated contempt. It was contempt for our intelligence, a bet that we would be cattle, easily herded by the emotion of the moment. It was contempt for our ability to discern, a belief that we couldn't separate the signal from the noise. And most seriously of all, it was contempt for the memory of a missing child. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann, the real pain of her family, and the search for justice were desecrated, turned into raw material, into fuel for the largest and most effective smokescreen I have ever had the misfortune to witness. For me, the doubt no longer exists. It wasn't an accident. It was an orchestrated operation executed with terrifying precision. And the fact that it worked so well, that it fooled so many for so long, that's the part that truly keeps me up at night. Because if it worked once on such a massive scale, what's to stop it from working again? What's to stop it from working right now in another case, in another story, and we just haven't noticed yet? That's why this work exists. Because there are stories the world actively tries to forget, stories that the incessant noise of the media tries to bury under new layers of irrelevance. If you, like me, believe that these stories need to be told, that we have a duty to keep digging in the silence, to honor the truth even when it's inconvenient, this is the time to show that you're here. The super chat on this channel has never been about money. I want you to understand that deeply. It's a symbol. It's a silent signal sent through the noise of the internet that I'm not alone in this search. It's your way of looking into this darkness and saying, keep going. Someone who sends a super chat here isn't just a passive viewer. They are someone who refuses to be just an audience. They are someone who becomes part of the investigation. It's a gesture that says, to anyone who will listen, to those who manipulate and to those who seek, I'm looking at the whole board now. Now, after everything we've been through together, I want to know what this stirred up inside you. What was the point that touched you the most? Was it the perfection of the manipulation? The pain of powerlessness? The revelation of what was happening behind the scenes? That moment when you recognized yourself as the exiled detective? Leave your thoughts in the comments. It doesn't have to be a long text, it can be just a line, a word, a feeling, but let it be real. I will read every single one, because every voice that refuses to be silenced is a small victory against the darkness. Because if it hurt, if it bothered you, if it left you thinking, it's because it still matters. And for those who felt that this wound we open today is still throbbing, that this story can't just end here, know that you're right, it hasn't ended. Because the pattern we decoded today, the same tactic of misdirection, the same manipulation of public hope, was applied in an even more subtle way in another disappearance. A case that the police tried to close by force, with an explanation that defies logic and that hides a twist involving power, silence, and a truth that, if it came to light, would change everything. It's a story that begins where this one ends, with the uncomfortable question of who benefits when the truth is buried. That's where we're going next. If you have the courage to keep looking into the darkness, to follow the thread even when it leads to uncomfortable places, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The truth waits for those who are not afraid of it, and our search is just beginning.